Today we're going to look at one of the last sections in C2, which is a section on the Earth's resources. Now, this is a section that when you read through the statements, you might think, I'm not really sure about this area. But actually, there are some really short bits of knowledge that you need to have for this section. It's mostly memory based, which means the questions will almost certainly be recall questions or some sort of comparison. So actually, it's a really good part to get quite a lot of good marks on. So let's start with the simples. We're going to look at everything from points 57 to 61 today, and we're going to then have a separate video for the other sections, just so it's a little bit more easy to digest when you need to revise it. So first of all, let's look at resources. And this whole topic is about the natural resources that are available on Earth. And we can largely categorize those into two sections. We can categorize those into finite resources, and we can categorize those into renewable resources. Now, finite resources are defined as those which will run out one day. And the most obvious example of these are fossil fuels. And fossil fuels include oil, gas, and coal. And those are the obvious ones because we talk about them for a very long period of time in secondary school, and so you're probably most aware of them. When we talk about finite resources, though, we can also talk about things like metals. Lots of heavy metals that are found within the Earth's crust are things that are found in actually quite small supply and in small concentrations, which means that there's lots of mining that's done to get them, and we will one day run out of them. Now, the other side of that is our renewable resources. So things like wind, solar, geothermal, things that we can use, that the earth provides us, that we're not going to use up, we're not going to run out of. Now, ones that kind of don't come into either of these categories that are important to notice are things like water. Now, you might describe water as being something that we need to use sustainably, and that's because the amount of energy to make clean and potable water is quite high. But actually, there's an awful lot of water in total on our Earth. So we don't necessarily class it as a finite resource because it's unlikely that we're ever going to get to the point where we run out of it. Now, the reason that we talk about these two, yes, obviously it's for your GCSEs, but it's also vitally important that all citizens of Earth have a good understanding of how to live sustainably. And to live sustainably is to live in a way where we use resources at a rate which allows there to still be resources for later generations. So we don't use things at a super high rate, which means that we're going to run out of them. So how can we live more sustainably? So first of all, we can use less stuff. And that comes into the reduce, reuse, recycle. If we can use less natural resources for whatever reason and we're using whichever techniques that we want to, then we are inherently being more sustainable because there will be more left for next generations. The reduce, reuse, recycle template is a really important one to remember when we think about sustainability. It's important that we start with the reduce. So as I've said already, we reduce our single-use plastic usage, or we reduce our reliance on these finite resources such as fossil fuels. It's also to note that when we talk about fossil fuels and crude oil doesn't just give us our supply of fuels. Crude oil also gives us the feedstock for lots of other chemical industries. It's also how we make plastics. Plastics are made by a polymerization, which involves using alkenes. And we can get alkenes from fractional distillation of crude oil and through the cracking of large hydrocarbons. So they are really sought after molecules. We can reuse. So rather than going out and looking at taking more resources from the earth, can we reuse those that we already have? Not recycle. Recycle would involve energy to melt things down to reform, but can we reuse them in their same style and designs that we don't have to use energy to break that down? And finally, can we recycle where we cannot reduce and reuse? Can we get the materials that we have used once, or more than once in some cases, and can we reconfigure them so that we can use them again as something new? Now, recycling is really important. I don't want to take away from recycling, but recycling does have its downsides compared to reuse and reducing because there is an energy take up through breaking things down, melting things down, making new substances. So wherever possible, we should look to reduce and reuse before we recycle. And the other thing that you need to be aware of is looking at alternative synthetic techniques. So how can we, as the highly evolved species that we are, use different alternative techniques to replace some of the finite resources that we used to. One way is to look at the fertilizers we used to use. So in previous videos, we have talked about the Haber process, and we have talked about how the Haber process is how we make, on an industrial level, how we make ammonia. And ammonia is then used to make fertilizers. Historically, before the Haber process, one of the main ways we used to do this was using phosphorus rock and phosphate rock. And phosphate rock is a raw, finite material. So processes like the Haber process, whilst not perfect, because it does use a lot of energy, is still much better than using the finite resources that we have. So that's one example of an alternative synthetic technique that you might want to talk about in your exam. So that's basically all you need to know for that first few points on there. Now what we need to do is we need to look at the other key things in 59, 60 and 61. So these are about water treatment and these are about sewage treatment. It's not difficult, but there are some key things that you need to know. So firstly, let's look at water treatment. Now, first of all, we need to know the difference between pure water and potable water. Now, pure water is water that contains H2O only. And my very rubbish drawing here shows you that. You've got your H2O molecules and nothing else. Now, pure water is obviously perfectly able to be drunk, but it's very intensive to make. To make pure water would involve removing all of the dissolved substances that are naturally occurring in things like spring water. And so pure water is normally only used in industrial processes where you need a very pure starting material. Actually, what we make far more commonly is potable water. And potable water, if we look over slightly to this side, is one that contains water, obviously, but potable refers to it being drinkable. It's safe to drink. If it's potable, it is safe to drink. And if you look closely at the diagram, yes, you've got your H2Os in there, but you've also got these here, and these are meant to represent dissolved substances. Now, these are in every water that you buy. Even if you buy a bottle of water from a well-known brand that says pure water on it, or pure spring water on it, it's not actually pure water. It's water with dissolved substances in it. And those dissolved substances could be things like dissolved carbon dioxide, they could be minerals, they could be salts, and they're perfectly safe to drink. And actually, the dissolved carbon dioxide is what makes water really refreshing. And that's why, actually, it's a lot more tasty, if you can describe water as tasty, than pure water. Now, how do we make potable water? Well, there are two methods. The first one is that we use fresh water. Now, fresh water refers to water that has been collected from rainwater. It can be groundwater. It can be water that's collected in lakes and rivers. It's fresh water because it doesn't contain a high salt content. Now, we need to obviously clean this to make it safe for us to drink. And so what we do is we go through two steps. Now, this is highly simplified. And actually, in your filtration method, there are probably lots of filtration steps. But the first step is filtration. And so we pass the fresh water through filter beds to remove any insoluble particles. And what we actually do is we tend to pass it through filters of decreasing size. So we'll start with a large filter to take large impurities, getting smaller and smaller. Now, once we've done that and there are no more insoluble particles in the fresh water, we then need it to undergo a sterilisation portion, because sterilisation is how it's going to be safe for human consumption. Because that water, if it's been standing for any amount of time, will contain some microorganisms that could possibly be pathogenic. And hopefully you remember now that pathogenic refers to a microorganism that can cause disease. So we sterilise the water. We do this in a few different ways. So we could either do it using UV light. We can do it using a substance called ozone, which is actually O3. It's 3 oxygen molecules. Or we can use chlorine. And chlorine is used in things like swimming pools because it's easy to add. And actually, when you've got lots of bodies swimming in water, there's going to be lots of microorganisms in there that you need to remove. But we use lots of different methods depending on what's best for the specific place. Now, the other method to produce potable water is using salt water. And this process in general is called desalination. And saline refers to salt water, basically. So what we're trying to do here is remove the salt and other possible impurities. Now, the first way we can do that is using a process called distillation. Now, distillation, fundamentally, very basically, is the process of evaporation followed by condensation. So we evaporate the water in the saltwater solution. We then use a condenser to condense that steam, which will be pure water because the salt that was in that water will not evaporate. And so what you should be left over is just um, a, a, a selection of a very concentrated salt solution or dry salt. Now, we can do this in the lab. You have done it in the lab. You can use simple distillation to do this. However, on an industrial scale and on a scale required to produce potable water for a community, actually, you need a huge amount of energy. In order for it to be evaporated, you need lots of heat. You will need to heat that up very, very highly in order to cause that water to evaporate, and then you will need to have the equipment to then condense it. This also produces some wastewater, and this wastewater is incredibly salty and it's very difficult to dispose of safely because putting highly concentrated salt water back into the sea or into other places is actually very harmful to the wildlife in those places. So that's one method. The other method is reverse osmosis, and some of you I think will remember the phrase reverse osmosis, but perhaps won't remember the process. So reverse osmosis, if we think about what osmosis is water moving from an area of high concentration of water to an area of low concentration of water. So you go from a dilute solution to a more concentrated one. In reverse osmosis, we do exactly the opposite of that. We want the water to move away from where the concentration is. We want it to move away from where the salt is. And so we place that water under high pressure and it's passed through a membrane. Water passes through, but the ions and the molecules that are salt-based or other impurities cannot pass through. And so we obtain pure water that way, or potable water, I should say, that way. Now, the issue here is that this is a very expensive process. And it's an expensive process because, like I've mentioned to you previously, when you have to put things under high pressure, it requires a lot of energy and specialist equipment. It's also very wasteful because you do produce a large amount of wastewater which has the concentrated salt and impurities in there. Now, when we talk about treatment of water, what we have to appreciate is that for different communities on Earth, in different places on Earth, I should say, there are going to be different priorities. In an area where perhaps they do not get a large amount of rainfall, making potable water through fresh water isn't going to be the best idea. In fact, they're going to have some places will have far more access to salt water than they will to fresh water, and therefore these are the processes that will be used. Equally, somewhere that gets high rainfall but is perhaps more inland would have greater access to fresh water and therefore would undergo this. In this country, we tend to use this method here. We tend to obtain our potable water through fresh water, but we do a little bit of this if rainfall is low. So it's important again to note that the two things can run alongside each other. So that is how we treat water. Now, the next thing we need to look at is sewage treatment. Okay, now sewage in this case can mean a number of different things. When we talk about sewage, yes, we can be talking about the stuff that comes through our toilets, etc. But we can also be talking about wastewater produced by lots of different processes. So industrial processes, from agriculture, from farming, etc. And so when we do sewage treatment, we are removing things such as bacteria. And when I say bacteria, I really mean microorganisms. I can be talking about fungi here and viruses, etc. Nitrogen compounds, these are found in fertilizers and they can be quite damaging to ecosystems. Metal compounds that come from probably industrial processes, fertilizers, etc. Now, sewage treatment is a stepwise process, and so it's important that you understand these steps. So what I would recommend is after I've gone through them, please do pause the video so that you can make a note of these and perhaps think about having a little diagram in each step. Now, that's a method called dual coding, and it helps our brain to understand and to remember things when we have a visual representation to help us. So when we have sewage treatment, the first thing that we do is we screen to remove large grit. Now, when we say large grit, we mean those large bits of stuff that we can just get rid of nice and quickly. So it's a filtration method, but mostly it's about just passing it through large filters to get rid of the large pieces. After that process and we've removed large pieces of grit, what we then do is we do sedimentation. Now, sedimentation is simply allowing the smaller pieces of grit and particles to settle. And so what you get at the bottom of your container is a layer of sediment at the bottom that you can then remove. That means that everything above it hopefully should have far less of these tiny particles. So it's basically a method of filtration. You then move the water off and collect the sediment and dispose of it. Then the sludge that you are left with is then digested by anaerobic bacteria, okay, and that's to help it break it down. And lastly, your effluent, okay, that's your waste that you've got, is then treated with aerobic bacteria to remove the volume of waste. Because I'm sure you can imagine that the amount of waste that is taken off through sewage treatment is huge. And actually, that's very difficult to deal with. So what we do is we allow aerobic bacteria to break it down, to not eat it, but if we want to think of it like that, we can do. And that reduces the volume of that waste and makes it easier for us to treat it. So that has been the first section of the Earth's resources. Make sure, if you need to pause and go back to make notes on anything that you need to. And like I said, use little diagrams, flashcards, etc. In our next video, we will talk about copper, about extraction of copper, and about how we can purify it.